Hi, my name is Janice Chik Breidenbach, and I will be speaking on the significance of human work for the thought of Karol Wojtyla, later known as Saint Pope John Paul II. And I want to begin, of course, by thanking Professor Ligia Castaldi for inviting me so graciously to offer a talk for this conference sponsored by the Ave Maria Law School, as well as the Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski University. So my topic today is work. Is there a right to work? And is there a right to work in a certain way? And of course, human work has profound significance within the context of human life and human nature. John Paul II himself was no stranger to manual labor, as many people know. His many writings, as well as his poetry, express the great solidarity that he felt, especially with the ordinary worker. And he tells us in Laborem Exercens that the goodness of work can be traced to the moment of creation. So he writes, at the beginning of man's work is the mystery of creation. Now, as beautiful as this statement is, I want to ask the question, how does it follow from this metaphysical and theological understanding of man as a worker to say that work, therefore, can be claimed as a human right? So what exactly does it mean for the late Pope to say that to work is a human right? And how does the philosophical claim of the worker as a person entail what seems to be strong political claims about workers' rights? In order to answer these questions, I think it's necessary to bring together two strands of thought, not only JP2's understanding of human work, but also his concept of human action as done and experienced by a person, what is now called Wojtylan personalism. So I have two tasks in this paper. The first will be to address in an integral way both work and human action as a personal act. My second task is to actually clarify and resolve some possible challenges to Pope John Paul II's account of work as personal action, or what he calls actus personae. So I'm going to summarize these challenges as twofold. First, as potentially sympathetic to aspects of Marxist thought, and second, as potentially sympathetic to aspects of anti-Aristotelian thought. Now, we know that John Paul II emphasizes throughout his works the dignity of human work for human life, and he championed the rights of workers, even sometimes through means such as workers' unions that have historically been politically controversial. And I think his argument about workers' rights must actually be read in light of his personalism. So work for him is human action, and this means that it's done by a human agent and a person. And in Laborem, he says, work in its subjective aspect is always a personal action, an actus personae. And therefore it follows that the whole person, body and spirit, participates in it, whether it is manual or intellectual work. And I want to argue that it's precisely in this kind of integrated reading that one will be surprised to find aspects of his thought that are actually seem to be sympathetic to Marxism, as well as aspects that make his account seem incompatible with Aristotelian. Both of these aspects, I think, we will find troubling as Catholic readers and as audiences that are sympathetic to Catholic social thought. So what do we make of this? Now, ultimately, of course, in my paper, I will be arguing that no, of course, John Paul II is not Marxist, nor is he actually anti-Aristotelian. But in some sense, these two poles of understanding, these two radical poles of understanding his work and giving it context, allow us to see that John Paul II is really driving a middle path between materialism and spiritualism. So neither is his thought materialist in his understanding of human work, nor is it excessively spiritualist. So my main sources are going to be the encyclical Laborem Exercens on human work, written in 1981, as well as an earlier essay titled Subjectivity and the Irreducible in Man, penned by the then Karol Wojtyla in 1976, as well as some scriptural passages. So I'm going to begin with the more difficult, the philosophical foundation and background to Wojtyla's thought on work. So I'm going to be looking at subjectivity and the irreducible in man. And firstly, what does Karol Wojtyla mean by what he calls the irreducible in man? And he says this is really what is originally or fundamentally human. What determines the total originality of man in the world. We assume a belief, or what he calls conviction, of the primordial originality of the human being, of his fundamental irreducibility of the world to nature. This conviction stands at the foundation of understanding man as a person. So Wojtyla is well known as asserting that man constitutes a separate suppositum. He says this is a kind of a subject of being and acting that is independent from the world. And he is an acting subject, the, quote, agent of his acts, but also, quote, a person as the subject experiencing his acts, his experiences, and in all this, his subjectivity, end quote. So first conclusion, man cannot be reduced to nature, to mere animality. Now we might ask at this juncture, why not just say that man acts? Why does Karol Wojtyla insist that he experiences himself as acting? So I think the first point here that the Pope is trying to make is to distinguish ourselves from the other animals. The other animals merely do, but we as human persons cannot but understand ourselves as doers, as agents, as active subjects within this experience of acting. And I think there's a lot of consonance here with what Aristotle tells us in the beginning of the Metaphysics. Aristotle says that we alone, of all the animals, have the power of self-reflection, of considering our experiences in a philosophical light, of thinking and understanding about the first principles of what we experience in our bodies. And I think the second point that Karol Wojtyla is trying to make through subjectivity is to really emphasize here the spiritual character of man. So he says that the irreducible signifies all that is invisible in man, all that is completely interior, and by which every man is, in a sense, an eyewitness of himself, his humanity, and his person. So here we find a kind of priority of the spiritual dimension of man above all natural things, that there's a kind of invisibility that really signifies the inner phenomena that is the life of man. And so here we get the following sort of formulation of the importance of this inner phenomena, the self-determination, he says, self-governance and self-possession of man. So he writes, the dynamic structure of self-determination tells man every time that he is both given and entrusted as a task to himself. Precisely in this way, man appears to himself in his acts, in interior decisions of conscience, as one who is constantly entrusted as a task to himself, who must constantly confirm, verify, and thereby, in a sense, constantly achieve the dynamic structure of his I, given to him as self-possession and self-governance. So here I want to turn now to some interpretive challenges of what Wojtyla is saying. And I think it's clear throughout his lifetime that John Paul II really intended to emphasize man's transcendence over nature by being a person in action. The emphasis here is on man's ability to experience himself as a subject within the moral landscape of values of good and evil. But it is possible to read his claims here in a Lockean light, to think that we are our own persons, that this is what is meant by self-possession and self-determinations, that we are proprietors of our own person, most of all, as Locke calls it, in his so-called state of nature. And so I think what Karol Wojtyla is saying here in subjectivity can actually be read, wrongly of course, within the hermeneutic of modern autonomy, of the rights of self-ownership, and especially bodily autonomy. It is also possible in reading subjectivity to think that he is departing entirely from the classical tradition in account of man as a rational animal. So after all, it's in this essay that he says that Aristotle's definition is, quote, built in a way that excludes, at least when we take it directly and immediately, the possibility of manifesting what is irreducible in man. It contains, at least in the foreground, a conviction of the reducibility of man to the world. So it seems, I think, to some readers of Wojtyla that here there's a kind of there's a certain rejection of the Aristotelian definition as setting us at odds with nature, right? So, but here's the problem, that it does set us at odds with nature, that it imparts to us the cost of insisting on an extreme transcendence of humanity over the natural world. So I want to submit that these two challenges to Wojtyła's account of human agency pose fundamental problems for his account of work, so we have to clarify both of them. And here's the first problem for his account of work. There's too much emphasis here on the autonomy of the worker, on the autonomy of personal and private conscience. There's too much emphasis on the inner life of man as over the sort of external bodily experience. And this seems actually sympathetic with Marx or Marxist ideas. So it may be possible to compare John Paul II's concerns in Laborum about socio-economic exploitation with Marx's own critique of capitalism. And by capitalism, in fact, both JP2 and Marx mean the same thing. They mean a mode of production in which the owners of the means of production are not those who labor, and those who labor have no ownership whatsoever over what is produced. And famously, Marx condemns capitalism as necessarily imparting a psychological estrangement or alienation between the laborer and his own work. Marx says his labor is external to the worker. That is, it does not belong to his essential being, but rather belongs to another. And Marx's critique of capitalism, therefore, is premised on the idea that we must retain self-possession and ownership of oneself in one's own work. Now, these are terms that probably resonate with readers of John Paul II and Wojtyła, the earlier Wojtyła. So is John Paul II sympathetic with this kind of Marxist critique? Now, John Paul insists that man must be, quote, the subject of work, who truly shares in the production process, that he cannot be treated as, quote, a mere instrument subordinate to human labor. It is, he writes, a postulate of the order of social morality that labor must take priority over capital. And he says we cannot accept merely economic premises which result in an opposition between labor and capital. It is excessive bureaucratic centralization which makes the worker feel that he is just a cog in a huge machine moved from above, that he is, for more reasons than one, a mere production instrument rather than a true subject of work with an initiative of his own. Sounds a great deal like the Marxist critique. Now, of course, I think at the end of the day, John Paul II cannot possibly intend to commiserate with Marx on these points. One of the reasons for this is simply that Marx's infamous solution, which is a radical political and economic collectivism that eliminates any distinction between the owners of production and their workers, is simply a solution that John Paul II explicitly rejects. And when we read John Paul II carefully here, it becomes clear that it's not so much that he's worried about capitalism per se, as he is about the faith or trust that we may place in capitalist structures to simply produce moral values like justice. And so John Paul II even explicitly says in Laborans that socio-economic exploitation does not spring from the structure of the production process or from the structure of the economic process. So here's a radical departure from Marx. Whereas Marxist self-possession and workers' autonomy actually springs from the class struggle that inevitably arises from societal structures, John Paul II's emphasis on self-possession and the rights of workers emerges rather from basic moral and metaphysical claims about human nature. Now, it is, I think, fair to say that there are aspects of his work that seem sympathetic all the same to Marx. For instance, he says that the struggle for social justice and workers' rights is real, so he says in Laborans in section 20, but because the human struggle for goodness and moral virtues is constant and real. So it's because of this more basic metaphysical and moral reality that this is the case. It's not a sort of primarily political reality. So unlike Marx, whose argument springs from a materialist account of the human being, of course, John Paul II's account of ownership or self-possession has to do with existing in a subjective experience of being in relationship with created reality. And ultimately, this is a theological thesis. So he writes, from the beginning, there is, linked with work, the question of ownership, for the only means that man has for causing the resources hidden in nature to serve himself and others is his work. And to be able, through his work, to make these resources bear fruit, man takes over ownership of small parts of the various riches of nature, those beneath the ground, those in the sea, on land, or in space. he takes over all these things by making them his workbench. He takes them over through work and for work. Only through these internal acts of personal ownership do we come to be, quote, sharers in responsibility and creativity at the workbench to which we apply ourselves, end quote. So I think it's clear here that the Pope is saying that no economic system can absolutely remove our ability to exercise this kind of free ownership over our own work, this kind of ownership that is so specific to human nature. Only we ourselves can renounce this original dignity through sin, he says, whose consequence includes a kind of degradation that we willingly take on, voluntarily giving up our original spiritual authority over material creation in favor of something so much lower and meaner. So Marx's concern, we might say, is political in a very limited sense of the word political, whereas John Paul II's is sort of comprehensively theological and philosophical. Work as a human right in his account is not really just about the dominion and subjugation of certain political groups, but primarily about a philosophical and theological meaning of man, a reality, and the reality of our activity within this natural and created world. So it's important here to see that John Paul II affirms the goodness of work and the goodness of man as a worker, because it's through work that man shows himself to be a person, the master and lover of material creation that the first man, Adam, was meant to be. So here, John Paul II quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, who calls work a bonum arduum, a difficult good, a good that takes effort to attain. And John Paul II writes, quote, even when it is accompanied by toil and effort, work is still something good, and so man develops through love for work, end quote. Work, therefore, if we want to speak theologically, is redemptive, because it recovers the original meaning of our humanity. It is man's means of sanctification, not because we are sinful, but because God has made us good. And it is through work, John Paul II argues, that man achieves fulfillment as a human being, and indeed, in a sense, becomes, he says, more a human being. As a person, he writes, man is therefore the subject of work. As a person, he works, he performs various actions belonging to the work process, and independently of their objective content, these actions must all serve to realize his humanity, to fulfill the calling to be a person that is his by reason of his very humanity. And I think here, again, it's important to note that this goodness in man can and does exist in all economic systems under all circumstances in which the human worker finds work. So I move now to the second problem, the sort of seeming anti-Aristotelianism in John Paul II's writing. And I think here the problem is this, that it results in a kind of exaggerated sense of the transcendence of man, which sets us at odds with nature as alien to the rest of creation. And this means that our work, too, the fruit of our labors, is foreign relative to the processes of nature. We are not, therefore, what Aristotle says, animal rationale, rational animals, but rather persons with a transcendence over nature via our capacity for experiencing ourselves as subjects of our own work and not just cogs within a mechanized process. So I think for many readers, this has entailed a kind of anti-Aristotelianism. And I think here it's important to note that at the end of the essay, Subjectivity, John Paul II asks, and he asks very honestly and openly, whether this Aristotelian idea of animal rationale and his personalist approach actually can be compatible. And he says this is an essential and burning question, right, that actually he leaves entirely unanswered in the essay. And I think here it's imperative, especially for his account of work, to explore this synthesis. So we might take his own suggestion and begin in the story of creation and explore it there. So it's in the Garden of Eden, where humanity is created, that we might be able to discern what manner of created being we are, for what purpose we were made. We might notice here that, first of all, Adam doesn't just sit around on his hands waiting for Eve to come into the picture. Before he meets her, he works. And Genesis tells us that he names each of the animals. So Genesis says all of the tame animals, all the birds of the air, and all of the wild animals. So God gathers all the animals in the world and presents them to Adam to see what he would call them. Whatever the man called each living creature was then its name. So some people may find it initially strange that naming animals should be called work, right? I think a lot of people think real work is physical labor, it's bodily involving, it's sweat and blood and tears. And yet, God gives Adam a kind of work that no other animal can do. He gives him a kind of intellectual work, a work that befits his rational nature, and therefore affirms Adam's spiritual preeminence within created nature. So naming a thing, we might notice, is quite similar actually to declaring it so by fiat. It's kind of a quasi-divine action. And so I think there's resonance here with what John Paul II argues in Laborans. He says work can be both material and intellectual. And this is important to him to explore the connection between both types. I think it's natural for, well, especially we intellectuals, to think that primarily it's in the intellectual that our nature is revealed. But we should notice too that Adam's naming is also bodily involving. He does not work entirely by divine fiat, right? So God's divine fiat is efficacious by a mere divine thought. We are rational, therefore, but we are also bodily creatures. And therefore, although we exist within material reality, we are distinguished within it as exceptional. So some philosophers will recognize this thesis as the thesis of hylomorphism, right? That we are a unity of body and soul and not merely souls sort of captive in bodies, in material stuff. So the power to name here, I think, is very significant because it reveals, firstly, an undeniable authority that the first man exercises over subhuman creation, which in turn is malleable in his hands. It's subordinate to his power. But this authority also reveals a kind of relationship, and this is significant. It's a relationship that exists through the work itself, through the work of naming. And we see this also in the fact that Genesis actually distinguishes for us between tame and wild animals presented to Adam, which suggests maybe that Adam's work includes domestication and husbandry. And here too, Adam's work affirms his nature as a relational being because taming an animal requires forging actively a relationship of mutual advantage. So we are created for relationship, not only with God, but also with other created beings. And before original sin corrupts the world, Adam's work is itself a form of relationship that he knows should fulfill him in accordance with his nature as a social being. So here are the takeaways from this analysis, this synthesis that I've tried to forge between Genesis, the Genesis account, and Wojtyla's account. Work, I think we have to say, is not only material for us, but also spiritual and intellectual. However, work, paradigmatically for us, is material and bodily. And this is something that we share with the other animals, as we share many things, as Aristotle notes. However, it is exceptional as a form of bodily work, for no other animal experiences its labor as simultaneously spiritual. So on this point, human work as done by a personal subject, and this is the personalist thesis, is necessarily supported by, and in fact supports, the Aristotelian thesis. That's what Wojtyla calls the cosmological thesis, that we are rational animals. And the creation story reveals that through our work, we are made to be in relationship not only with God, but also with the rest of natural creation. Adam's first work in naming the animals establishes a relationship with created reality. Therefore, the transcendence of man is not so radical that we are absolutely other or foreign to natural creation. We and our work are part of creation, but exceptionally distinguished within it. So here, I think John Paul II's personalist approach to work and the rights of workers is not only absolutely consistent with Aristotle's thesis that we are rational animals, but in fact requires the cosmological definition for its own coherence. Okay, so as a conclusion, we might raise one more question. The final question here is one that remains, which is that how does the seemingly political thesis of work as a right come about from the foregoing metaphysical and theological reflection? So kind of initial response to this might be, it seems from the theological point of view that work is not so much a right as it is a duty. Work is a punishment as a consequence of sin. So after the fall, one might notice God says to Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, you are dust, and to dust you shall return." So human work in the context of sin now seems to be linked to disempowerment, difficulty, and death. And the divine mandate to take sustenance is no longer underpinned by an assumption of freedom to choose among many goods. And before the fall, it was you may freely eat of every tree in the garden. But now it is charged with the curse of sensual desire and the limitations of the physical body. So God says, you shall eat bread in the sweat of your face. So instead of being masters of the earth, humanity's punishment is now that we might be subdued by the earth itself, that we might be sort of oppressed by material forces that were originally under our command. Now, there may be some truth here to say that work is therefore a duty, an obligation, rather than a right, but it's not a great answer to our question. Here's a second answer. Work is a right, but we have to understand it as a right in the ancient sense of being a basic human need without which we cannot be happy. So here, work is a kind of natural good, a basic good that's comparable to friendship and community. So in the ancient context, right, in the Republic, for instance, Plato once argued that one of the greatest evils that has ever befallen man is that an able-bodied person might live in a city but not have any work to do in it, that he might have no role to fulfill in service to a city that he inhabits. And so Plato's description in Republic is that such a man, he says, continues to live in the community without being one of its limbs. So that is to say that he's cut off. He's no longer serving an essential part within the unified whole of society. And I think it's really in this ancient light that John Paul II is observing that unemployment is a great affront to human dignity. And here is, I think, where significantly the meaning of work also informs the meaning of the family, one of these basic goods that is so significant to us as well. And like Plato and Aristotle, John Paul II teaches us that the goodness of work actually presumes the goodness of human relationships. The most significant of these, of course, is the relationship of the fellowship of the family, and we see this in the Genesis account as well. And this is why Marx's objection to capitalism cannot be resolved simply by handing to the worker capital ownership over his labors, as Marx thought. So John Paul II in Laborum says, man must work out of regard for others, especially his own family, but also for the society he belongs to, the country of which he is a child, and the whole human family of which he is a member, since he is heir to the work of generations, and at the same time a sharer in building the future of those who will come after him in the succession of history. Now, what St. John Paul II is telling us is this: our social relationships not only begin at home, but our concept of family must be extended to all of society and broadened beyond what is immediately our own. So society itself is our family, and likewise, our work is not just for our own self-fulfillment, but carries with it the rights and obligations of being performed and done for others, out of service for others, and ultimately for our Creator himself, who is the divine worker. Thank you.